"You call that music?" He sneered across the royal ballroom, his voice dripping with disdain. The crowd froze, the lights dimmed, and a 16-year-old girl in borrowed heels stepped toward the grand piano, humiliated, dismissed, and visibly trembling. But no one knew what she carried inside her. When Clara Hayes sat at those keys, she didn't just play. She summoned a forgotten melody, one only the Queen's late sister had ever dared perform. A melody in a sacred key, a mother's key. By the time she hit the final note, the room wasn't clapping, they were weeping. What followed was a journey of redemption, legacy, and a love born through music. From Paris rehearsal halls to a broken church reborn, Clara and her once rival Miles Kingsley would compose a movement that would change lives and build a sanctuary called Harmony, where every unheard voice would finally be welcomed home. Now, before we dive deeper, please like and subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know what time and where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now, let's get back to the story. "You call that music?" The voice cracked through the crystal air like thunder in a church, cold and careless. Every head in the royal ballroom turned in the direction of the sound. At the edge of the polished stage, Lord Bertram Kingsley leaned back in his velvet-lined chair, swirling brandy in a glass far older than any performer tonight. His eyes, icy, unblinking, were fixed on the program leaflet, where a single name had just been announced over the loudspeaker. Clara Hayes, age 16. Performing in place of Lady Annabelle. Bertram didn't bother to lower his voice. "Some public school charity project? This is a royal gala, not a nursery recital." The hush that followed was excruciating. Conversations died mid-sentence. The string quartet packed in the corner lowered their instruments. Even the servers paused, holding trays mid-air, unsure whether to walk or vanish. Behind the grand red curtain, Clara froze. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She'd only stepped closer to hear her cue, clutching her folded sheet music and smoothing the creases in her second-hand gown. But his words reached her, sliced through her like a shard of glass. Sharp, elegant, and laced with the authority of someone who'd never been questioned in his life. Her knees trembled. She stared at the piano just beyond the curtain's edge. Its black lacquered surface reflected the chandeliers above like a pool of moonlight. She'd never played one so grand before, never played in front of royalty, never been this terrified. A hand touched her shoulder. It was Alfred, the head butler, and the only person who had spoken kindly to her all evening. A silver-haired gentleman with gentle eyes and gloves as white as snow, he looked at her with something different from pity. Something steadier. "Don't play for them," he said softly. "Play for the reason you started." Clara swallowed hard. The room on the other side of the curtain felt miles away from the quiet music halls where she'd first learned to play on an out-of-tune upright. Miles away from the little attic where her mother used to sit beside her, whispering counts of 1, 2, 3, feel it, don't force it. Her fingers tightened around the music sheets, and for a moment she debated turning back. The exit door behind her was slightly ajar. The cold night outside would feel less brutal than this. But then she remembered the note her mother had written in the margin of her favorite composition. "When they listen, make them remember something they forgot." The stage manager whispered, "You're on in 30 seconds." Clara closed her eyes, took one deep breath, and walked forward. The hush deepened. A soft murmur passed through the audience like the rustle of autumn leaves. Her steps echoed across the wooden floor. The heels she wore were a size too big, borrowed from a neighbor who believed no girl should perform barefoot in front of aristocrats. She reached the bench, sat, adjusted the hem of her dress. Her hands placed the music sheets on the stand, only to find half the pages missing. Her chest tightened. They'd been there earlier. She had checked. She knew. Her heart thumped wildly now, a traitor in her ribcage. She turned slightly, her gaze skimming the audience until her eyes met those of a younger man seated next to Lord Kingsley. The apprentice. Miles Kingsley, the critic's grandson and a rising socialite composer. He was smirking. The sheets. He had taken them. Or had someone take them. She didn't need proof. She could feel it in the smug tilt of his chin. The cruelty was deliberate. Clara looked back at the keys. The room began to shift into a blur, as if everything unimportant had melted away. leaving only 88 black and white choices in front of her. She could walk away. Or she could play something else, something that lived beneath her skin, something her fingers knew even if the sheets were gone. Her mother's melody. She exhaled slowly, whispering under her breath. "For you." Then she began. The first note fell awkwardly. Her hands, stiff with nerves, missed a grace note. A soft chuckle rose from somewhere in the back. Lord Kingsley tilted his head with disdain, whispering to the man beside him. Predictable. Clara closed her eyes. And the second note changed everything. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't meant to be. But it was real. Her fingers began to flow with a rhythm that came from memory, not technique, from Saturday afternoons spent watching her mother cook while Clara played by the kitchen window, the scent of rosemary in the air and sunlight on her knuckles. The melody danced upward, light and trembling, and then dipped into something deeper. Minor chords bled into major lifts. Clara's body swayed gently with the music, as though it wasn't her performing, but the memory of every hardship she'd survived. The ballroom listened, not politely, intently. Even those who had whispered at first now leaned in. And then, halfway through her piece, a sudden motion cut the moment in half. Lord Kingsley stood. He did not clap, did not nod. He stood with stiffness, an unspoken reprimand. "I will not sit through sentimental drivel masquerading as art," he declared, loud enough for all to hear. "This is not the place for children to practice their grief." Gasps. Clara's hands paused midair. A note died on her thumb. A single tear slipped down her cheek. But she didn't get up. She didn't bow or apologize. Instead, she made a decision. She gently removed the sheet music from the stand, folded it, set it aside. Then she placed her hands back on the keys and began to play the national anthem. But not the way anyone expected. Not the way it was written in the royal books. Not the way it was performed at formal state dinners. She played it in F-sharp minor, a key known to almost no one but those who had studied the Duchess Eloise Kingsley, Lord Bertram's late mother. She had once said it captured the ache of a country healing after war. Clara had read that quote 100 times in a yellowed biography at the library. She had listened to the Duchess's private recording, studied the key change, felt something stir in her even then. Now, on this stage, she let that version bloom like a garden suddenly remembering spring. The melody was the same, recognizable, reverent, but it carried shadows. It shimmered with nostalgia and longing. The hall fell into a stunned silence. People no longer whispered. They watched. Some closed their eyes. Some reached for handkerchiefs. And Lord Kingsley? He sat. Slowly, quietly. The air had shifted. His bravado drained. As Clara reached the final crescendo, her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from everything she had poured into that song. And as the last note hung in the ballroom like a blessing suspended in gold light, no one moved. Not a breath. Not a clap. Just a moment, where memory, music, and meaning held the entire room still. And in that stillness, Clara knew. She had played for something greater than applause. She had played for love, for loss, for legacy, for her mother, for herself, for the woman whose key she borrowed, and the man who had just been reminded of the difference between royalty and grace. A sound emerged, not from the piano, not from the stage, but from deep within the hall. A single clap, then another, then it grew. Applause began to scatter across the ballroom like hesitant raindrops. But quickly, like a storm catching fire, it erupted into a standing ovation. Not the kind offered politely after protocol performances, but the kind torn from something deeper, something that had been asleep in people for too long. Some clapped with their hands, others with their eyes brimming, and others still, stunned into stillness, simply stared as if they weren't ready to re-enter the world after what they'd just heard. But not Lord Kingsley. He remained seated. His hands didn't move, his expression unreadable, but not indifferent. Something had shattered inside the man, and Clara saw it. She rose quietly from the bench, her head bowed not in shame, but in reverence. She didn't soak in the applause like a child desperate for praise. She simply looked up toward the rafters, as if someone invisible was watching. Then she whispered beneath her breath, "That was for you too, Duchess." A footman stepped toward her hesitantly, as if unsure whether to usher her off stage or escort her into history. But before he reached her, someone else stood. From the royal box above, the Queen's niece, Lady Charlotte, stood and placed her hand over her heart. A symbolic gesture, but a thunderous one in a room ruled by status and subtlety. More nobles followed. Lords, countesses, foreign ambassadors. The butler Alfred, standing near the back, was now dabbing his eyes with a cloth so white it glowed under the chandeliers. But Clara didn't see most of it. Her vision blurred with emotion, her body light with exhaustion. It was as though she had run a marathon on piano keys and left behind something irreplaceable on every note. Backstage, the velvet curtain fell slowly. The applause muffled. She exhaled. Behind the curtain, Miles Kingsley waited. His smirk had vanished, replaced with something sour and confused. He stepped toward her. "You got lucky," he said too quickly, as if needing to reassert control. "Pulling the Anthem stunt? Cheap sentiment. You think they'll remember that tomorrow?" Clara didn't answer right away. She simply looked at him with the calm you find only in someone who has stopped needing permission to exist. "No," she said. "I don't think they'll remember me. I think they'll remember how it made them feel." He rolled his eyes, but his jaw tensed. Something in him knew she was right. He turned away, the hollow echo of his expensive shoes fading as he retreated into a corner where no light dared follow. Clara slipped past him, walking down the corridor with the sound of applause still lingering in her bones like the last shimmer of a dream. She was almost to the dressing room when Alfred appeared at the end of the hallway. He didn't speak. He only held something in his hands, the sheet music she had lost. It was torn, not carelessly, but deliberately. One page folded in half, a crease down the middle like a scar. Her eyes widened, recognizing the ink smudges, the notes she had scribbled in the margins just before stepping into the car that brought her to the palace. "Where did you?" she began. "I found them in the wastebasket outside the private balcony," Alfred said quietly, his voice a mix of apology and pride. "Seems someone thought art was disposable. You proved them wrong." Clara took the pages, smoothing the creases as if they were part of something sacred. "You were magnificent, child," Alfred added, then after a pause, "you reminded them that music is not bred, it's born." She blinked back tears. "Thank you for believing in me." Alfred bowed, not with ceremony, but with genuine respect. And then he stepped aside as she opened the dressing room door. Inside, the lights buzzed softly. Her reflection looked back from the mirror, flushed and disheveled, yet somehow aglow. Her hair slightly undone from the performance, her eyes swollen from tears she didn't even know she'd cried. She sat slowly, placing the sheet music on the vanity. Her fingers hovered above the keys on the practice keyboard nearby, but she didn't play. Not yet. Instead, her mind wandered back, years ago. A dusty attic, a broken metronome ticking slower than time. Her mother beside her, hands guiding hers, whispering, "Don't worry about the notes, Clara. Play the spaces between them." She smiled at the memory. Outside the dressing room, footsteps approached. Then a knock. She turned. It wasn't Alfred. It was Lord Kingsley. The hallway light cast his shadow long across the floor. His back was stiff, his hands behind him, but his expression, it had changed. No longer arrogant, no longer dismissive, but uncertain. He waited. Then with effort he said, "May I?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. He entered without grandeur, as though stepping into a confession booth rather than a dressing room. For a long moment he didn't speak, only looked around as if unsure what to do in a space so plain. Finally his eyes settled on the sheet music beside her. "That arrangement," he said quietly. "The anthem. That key." Clara straightened. "It was hers, wasn't it?" He nodded, his voice caught. "My mother, she wrote that modulation herself. Only ever played it once publicly. During the war," she said. "She wanted people to feel the ache in hope." Clara nodded softly. "I found it in an old archive. I listened to the recordings so many times, I could hear her breath in the pauses." He sat across from her. Slowly, carefully, as if he feared he might break something invisible in the room. "She taught me to play once," he murmured, almost to himself. "I was terrible, always too concerned with control, with being correct." Clara waited, not pressing, not performing, just listening. "I didn't just lose her when she died," he continued, eyes far away. "I lost the only part of myself that believed music should move people, not impress them." He looked at her then, really looked. "You brought her back to me tonight. I didn't expect that. I didn't want it. But, thank you." Clara's throat tightened. "She's still here, you know, not in the music, but in the people it touches." He closed his eyes, a breath. Then, he reached into his coat and pulled out something small and velvet. A box. He placed it on the table between them. "I never gave this to anyone," he said. "My mother's pin. She wore it at every performance. Maybe you should have it." Clara opened the box. Inside, a delicate golden treble clef glinted, encircled by ivy and tiny pearls. It was beautiful, humble, yet regal. "I can't take this," she whispered. "You already did," he replied. "You just didn't know it." She took the pin with trembling hands, held it like it might disappear. Her voice was barely a breath. "Thank you." Lord Kingsley stood, adjusted his coat, and walked to the door. But before he left, he turned. "You're not just a pianist, Miss Hayes. You're a reminder." And with that, he disappeared down the hall, leaving behind silence and a heart finally changed. Clara sat alone, the pin in her palm, the sheet music beside her, and a reflection that no longer looked like a scared girl in borrowed heels, but a young woman who had stood in the fire and played through it. Outside, the wind carried the faint echoes of a melody once forgotten. But in this moment, in this room, it had found a new voice. Hers. The moon had risen by the time Clara stepped outside the royal hall. The marble stairs leading into the courtyard glowed under its light, and though the gala continued inside, laughter and strings echoing faintly, she needed air. Her hands still tingled, not from nerves anymore, but from the memory of what had passed through them. Her fingers had become something more than flesh and bone tonight. They had become vessels for something ancient: grief, heritage, redemption. As she reached the edge of the fountain in the middle of the courtyard, she sat on the cold stone rim and stared at her reflection. The surface shimmered with moonlight, her face a quiet blur between the ripples. The pin Lord Kingsley had given her was still clenched in her hand. She didn't know how long she stayed there, but the hush of the night was broken by a voice, familiar now, slightly amused, slightly uncertain. "You know, she played here too." Clara turned. It was Miles Kingsley. He stood beneath a stone archway, hands in his coat pockets, expression unreadable. For the first time, he didn't carry the smugness he'd worn earlier. Instead, he looked like someone caught between the man he was raised to be and the boy who once watched his grandmother perform. Clara said nothing. He took a few steps closer, glancing toward the piano-shaped garden in the distance. Bushes trimmed like notes on a staff, a centerpiece of the palace's homage to music. She played the anthem there. During a thunderstorm, they told her it wasn't appropriate for a duchess to get wet. She told them art didn't wait for permission. A pause. Miles sat at the far end of the fountain, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. The quiet between them was heavy but not hostile. "I shouldn't have touched your music," he finally said. Clara blinked. She didn't expect the apology, and for a second she didn't know how to answer it. "You didn't want me to play," she said quietly. He shook his head. "No, I didn't want to be shown up. I thought, maybe if I rattled you, you'd stumble, and I'd still be the one they remembered." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked back into the water. "I didn't come to take anything from anyone," she said. "I came to play." Miles nodded. His voice was almost fragile now. "You reminded me of her, of Eloise, my grandmother. It scared me. You had her courage, her ears." Clara's eyes softened. She was everything I dreamed of being. "You were more than that tonight," he said. "You were her for a moment." They sat in silence again. The wind rustled through the hedges, carrying with it the scent of lavender and old stone. Finally, Clara turned to him. "Why are you telling me this?" Miles hesitated. "Because," he said slowly, "I've spent years composing in secret, afraid none of it would measure up. And tonight, watching you, I realized I've been hiding behind my family's name while you fought for every note you played." His voice broke slightly and he looked away. "I want to show you something." She frowned. "Now?" He stood, nodded. "Please, it'll only take a minute." Clara hesitated, but something in his tone wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't royal, it was real. She rose and followed. He led her through a side corridor, one that wound through the palace's old music wing. The lights dimmed as they passed under arches, past portraits of musicians long gone, painters, violinists, composers, all captured mid-motion, as if frozen in the act of dreaming. At the end of the corridor, a heavy door waited. Miles unlocked it with a key from around his neck. He opened it slowly, revealing a chamber lit by candles with a single piano in the center, weathered, ivory cracked, and deeply loved. This was hers, he said. Duchess Eloise's practice room. Clara stepped in as if into a sacred chapel. The air smelled of varnish and old parchment. Sheet music lined the walls in handwritten scrawl. Photos yellowed with time clung to the edges of the mirror. And above the piano hung a framed score, the original transcription of the national anthem in F-sharp minor. I never let anyone in here, Miles said, voice hushed. But tonight, I think she would have wanted you to see it. Clara stepped forward, fingertips brushing the edge of the piano. The bench creaked as she sat. Play, Miles said, almost a whisper. Anything. She paused. Then softly she began a melody she hadn't played in years, a lullaby her mother once wrote, one she used to hum in the dark when Clara couldn't sleep. It was simple, almost childish, but in this room it sounded like something ancient. Miles watched, unmoving, until the final note faded. When it did, he stepped forward, opened a drawer, pulled out a worn composition notebook. I wrote something, he said. Years ago. I never showed anyone. I think it's missing something. Maybe someone. He placed it gently beside her. Clara opened it. The pages were filled with ink, bold, unsure, experimental. There were erasures, loops, rewritten sections. It was raw, but it had soul. It's beautiful, she said. Miles's face lit up, not with arrogance, but with relief. I was hoping you'd say that. A moment passed. Something shifted. The silence between them no longer held tension, but invitation. Then the palace bell chimed midnight. Distant. Clara closed the notebook. Stood. I should go, she said, but her voice held no urgency. Miles nodded. Will I see you again? Clara smiled. Not coy, not dramatic, just a soft smile. Maybe, she said, if the music calls. As she turned to leave, her hand brushed the edge of the Duchess's piano one last time. Her fingers lingered like a goodbye. When she stepped back into the hallway, the air felt warmer somehow, as if the room behind her had given her something invisible but lasting. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was chasing a dream alone. Because now she was a part of one. The morning light crept slowly over the rooftops of London, soft and golden, casting long, honey-colored shadows across the cobblestone streets below. A gentle fog rolled in from the river, shrouding the city in a kind of delicate stillness, like the world itself was holding its breath after something sacred had been said the night before. In the quiet heart of the city, nestled between a bookstore that hadn't changed its window display in 5 years and a flower shop that opened too early for anyone but dreamers, stood the modest boarding house where Clara lived. She had arrived just after dawn, coat wrapped tightly around her and the music pin from Lord Kingsley still hidden in her pocket, like a secret meant for no one else. As she walked up the creaking stairwell to her floor, her feet dragged not from exhaustion, but from something weightier, something she couldn't name. Her body was still in this world, but her spirit was trailing behind, lingering in the palace where melodies had once again meant something. When she opened the door to her small attic room, everything inside seemed smaller than before. Too humble, too quiet, too unchanged. The stack of piano books on the floor, the chipped teacup on the sill, the faded photo of her mother tucked into the corner of the mirror. Clara stood in the center of the room and didn't move. She was afraid if she blinked too long, the whole night would vanish like a dream. But there it was. The evidence. The sheet music, torn and taped back together, clutched in her bag. The velvet box with the treble clef pin, now resting on her desk. And inside her, still, the echo of that final note. She sat at her old upright piano. The keys were yellowed and a few stuck if you weren't careful. Her fingers hovered above them for a moment, then dropped gently. Not to play, but to feel. As if she needed to remind herself that this place still loved her too. A soft knock at the door. She turned. For a moment, she thought perhaps she'd imagined it. No one ever came this early. Then again, a second knock, timid, unsure. She opened the door. Standing there, panting as if he'd run blocks to get there, was Louis, the boy from downstairs who delivered mail in the mornings and played cello in the evenings. His mop of curls was soaked from the fog, and his backpack swung awkwardly from one shoulder. "You're famous," he blurted, shoving a folded newspaper into her hands. Clara blinked. "What? It's on the front page." "Well, not the front page, but like, the music section, which is kind of the front page for people like us, right?" She unfolded the paper. There it was, A grainy black and white photo of her on stage, head bowed, fingers on keys, bathed in light. The headline read, "Girl in the Duchess's Key, a royal gala remembers music's power." She sank slowly into the chair beside her piano, her eyes scanning the text. An unknown pianist stunned guests at last night's Royal Arts Gala with a rendition of the national anthem in the late Duchess Eloise Kingsley's signature key. A key forgotten by most, remembered by one, and resurrected with astonishing grace. Her breath caught. Her chest rose and fell as the words sank in. They'd written about the music. Not the gown she wore, not the fact she was young or poor. They wrote about what mattered. Louis grinned from ear to ear. "There's more. The palace issued a statement, said your performance was a living tribute to legacy. And there's a rumor that someone on the royal committee's drafting a scholarship proposal in your name." Clara stared at the page, numb. "Also," Louis added, digging through his backpack with both hands, "there's this." He pulled out a sealed envelope. Embossed, pale ivory, the royal crest pressed in gold. She didn't move. "You gonna open it?" he asked, bouncing on his heels. Clara ran her thumb under the flap. Inside, a single folded card, handwritten. "Miss Hayes, you reminded us that nobility lives not in title, but in courage. Thank you for waking something we had allowed to sleep far too long. We would be honored if you performed again. This time, not as a replacement, but as the headline. With deepest respect, Lady Charlotte of Wexley." Clara's vision blurred. Headline. Not the background, not the afterthought. She pressed the letter to her chest, eyes closed, heart pounding like a hymn. Louis stood awkwardly by the door. "So, does this mean you're going to be like, super famous now? You'll forget us and go live in a castle and play for presidents and stuff?" Clara laughed softly, wiping her eyes. "No, Louis. I'll still live above the flower shop, at least for now." He looked relieved. "Good, because your mom's piano deserves to keep hearing you." She smiled. "Thank you," he shrugged. "You earned it." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, there's one more thing." He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a tiny envelope, plain, hand-addressed. From M. Kingsley. Clara felt a strange flutter in her chest. Inside, a single note card, inked in elegant script. "What would you say to a duet? I have a melody, but you have the soul." Her fingers gripped the card tighter. She could almost hear the conversation already, their styles blending, her passion, his structure, her memory, his ambition. And maybe, if she was honest with herself, she didn't mind the idea of not making music alone anymore. That afternoon, Clara sat back at the piano. She laid out her mother's lullaby, Miles's composition, and an empty page. Then she began writing something new. A piece that started not with a bang, but a whisper. A note that could only be heard by those who truly listened. Outside, the sky was clearing, the fog lifting. Inside, a melody was taking shape, one that would carry farther than anyone could yet imagine. Because sometimes the most powerful songs don't begin with applause. They begin with silence, and the courage to fill it. It was raining in Paris the night Clara stepped off the train. Not the kind of wild storm that battered umbrellas and turned streets into rivers, but the soft, silver kind, gentle as lace, steady as breath. It coated everything in a shimmer, and in that pale light, the city looked less like a place and more like a memory someone had painted in watercolor. She pulled her coat tighter, the collar turned up to shield her face, though no one knew her here. Yet something about being seen, even in passing by strangers, made her feel as if she had crossed into a chapter she hadn't meant to begin this soon. Miles had sent the invitation 2 weeks ago. "Come to Paris. I've reserved a room for you at the Conservatoire. 1 week, we'll rehearse, we'll rewrite, we'll create something that doesn't exist yet. And if you hate it, you never have to see me again." He had signed it without his last name this time. Just Miles. She had folded the letter twice, then again, until it fit neatly inside the pocket of her coat where the Duchess's pin still lived, a quiet talisman over her heart. Clara stepped into the waiting car, an old Citroën with creaky leather seats and a driver who hummed Debussy under his breath. The moment she sat down, her fingers tingled again, the way they always did when something important was about to begin. She didn't know yet what she would play, only that she had to. The Conservatoire rose like a palace of glass and sound, its windows lit like a constellation in the fog. When the car stopped outside, Miles was already there, standing under a black umbrella, his silhouette sharp in the glow of the lantern above him. He didn't wave. He didn't move toward her with ceremony or grin like some self-important composer awaiting applause. He simply watched her step out, then offered the umbrella without a word. She took it. Their hands brushed, briefly. "Bonsoir," he said. "Welcome to the quiet side of the world." Clara smiled. "I thought this was the city of noise." "It is," he said. "But we make music in the cracks between it." He led her inside. The rehearsal room was tucked at the back of the building, past winding halls and velvet ropes. It smelled of old books and polished wood, and in the center stood a Steinway grand that looked as though it had been waiting for decades just to meet her. No words, not at first. Clara removed her coat, Miles sat across from her with a notepad but didn't open it. "You remember the lullaby you played in Eloise's room?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "I couldn't stop thinking about it. The simplicity, the ache, the way it felt like someone whispering from another room." Clara tilted her head. "What do you want to build from it?" He hesitated. Then, with a reverence that almost startled her, he replied, "A requiem. But not for death, for forgetting, for the parts of us we leave behind when we try too hard to be someone else." The word struck something tender in her chest. And just like that, the room shifted. They began. At first, it was awkward. His tempo too rigid, her dynamics too raw. They stumbled through chords that didn't know where to land, melodies that pulled in opposite directions. But by the third hour, something clicked. She played a passage with her eyes closed, and when she opened them, Miles was already scribbling harmonies in the margin. He added a modulation, and she changed the left-hand phrasing in response. It wasn't seamless, but it was honest. And in the messiness of that honesty, something beautiful began to emerge. Each day blurred into the next. Mornings with black coffee and ink-stained fingers. Afternoons filled with arguments about dissonance and the poetry of silence. Evenings where they sat side by side on the piano bench and forgot they were supposed to be two people instead of one mind split into two bodies. They talked about her mother, about his grandmother, about the loneliness of prodigies and the weight of legacy. He showed her his worst pieces. She showed him her broken notebooks. They laughed more than they expected, and cried less than they should have. On the fifth night, as they were packing up, Clara paused, staring at the final measure of their piece. "There's something missing," she murmured. Miles looked up. "Where?" "Not in the notes," she said, "in the air between them." He stood, walked slowly around the piano, and without a word he sat beside her. Then, gently, he placed his hand over hers. Their eyes met, not as composer and pianist, not as the critic's heir and the girl who'd been booed, but as two people standing in the same quiet place inside themselves. And in that silence, something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition, an understanding, the kind that doesn't need language because it's been waiting too long for words. Clara pulled her hand away slowly, not because she wanted to, but because if she didn't, she wouldn't be able to think straight. "We're almost there," she whispered. Miles nodded. "We are." Outside, the rain had stopped, and somewhere in the city a bell was chiming the hour. They didn't sleep much that night. Instead, Clara stayed up by the window of her small apartment above the conservatory, replaying the phrases in her mind. Each note, each pause. The way his handwriting curved in the margins. The way the music told a story without ever needing to explain itself. She knew something had changed. Not just in the music. In her. In them. The next morning, she walked to the old chapel on the edge of the Seine. She had heard it had the best acoustics in Paris. And it was there, with dust motes dancing in the light of stained glass windows, that she sat again at the piano, alone this time, and played the first complete version of their piece. No audience, no applause, just breath and echo and memory. And when the final chord faded into silence, Clara closed her eyes. She could feel it. Something was coming. A performance, a moment, a reckoning, and she would be ready. Because now the music wasn't just hers, it was theirs, and it was strong enough to be heard by the world. The concert announcement went live on a Sunday morning. It was simple, almost understated. Requiem for the Forgotten, a new composition by M. Kingsley and C. Hayes. One night only, Palais Garnier. But within hours it was everywhere. Social media feeds, radio whispers, even the quiet corners of conservatory halls where music students swapped rumors like secrets. Some thought it was an experiment, others a redemption. But for those who knew, who remembered the girl in the Duchess's key, it felt like fate coming full circle. Clara read the article headlines with quiet disbelief. Not because she doubted the attention, but because it felt like watching someone else's life unfold. She had grown up dreaming of pianos with broken keys and stage lights that never pointed at her. Now she was the name on the poster, the ink on the program, the melody in people's mouths. But fame was never the goal. The music was, and it had never felt more alive. Miles called her the night before the performance. She was already in her dressing room, fingers curled around a cup of tea she'd barely touched, eyes on the rain tapping against the windows of the opera house. "You ready?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. He laughed softly. "Me neither." There was a pause. Then he added, "But the music is, and I think that's all that matters." She didn't reply. She just closed her eyes and listened to his breath on the other end. Even that felt like part of the score now. Quiet, nervous, human. The Palais Garnier had never looked more intimidating. That night, it shimmered with gold and velvet and whispered anticipation. The grand chandelier pulsed above the audience like a suspended moon, and the air inside the hall felt thick with something more than humidity. It was history, memory, expectation. Clara waited backstage, dressed not in something extravagant, but in a long black gown her mother once wore to a church recital. The hem had been altered, the seams adjusted, but the fabric still carried the scent of lavender and old piano benches. In her palm she held the Duchess's pin, a quiet weight, a promise. The lights dimmed, the murmurs died. And then, silence. She walked out slowly, each step echoing like a drumbeat. The audience was a sea of faces, half in shadow, all watching. Somewhere near the front sat Lord Kingsley, straighter than ever, and beside him, Lady Charlotte, serene and shining. Clara took her seat. The piano waited. A spotlight bloomed. She inhaled, long and deep, and lowered her hands to the keys. The opening note was soft, barely there. A whisper in a cathedral. It began with the lullaby, but not as she'd known it. Miles had reshaped the harmony, threading new emotion through the phrases like silk through lace. It wept, it reached, it asked. Then slowly it unfolded into something grander. The melody stretched wider, touched the walls of the opera house, then returned to itself, bruised and beautiful. Each section told a different story. There was one where the right hand rose in a frantic series of arpeggios, like memory trying to break free of forgetting. Another where the left hand fell in heavy chords, echoing the weight of silence that follows grief. Then came the duet. The moment Miles had joined her on stage, quietly, reverently. He stepped out from the wings and sat beside her, his eyes never leaving hers. No words, only breath. And then, sound. His harmony entered like a second heartbeat, and as they played, the room vanished. The ceiling, the walls, the audience, all of it faded behind the crescendo of what they were becoming. A conversation in music. A requiem not just for what was lost, but for what still longed to be remembered. There was no applause during the piece, no shifting in seats, only stillness, as if the world had finally remembered how to listen. And then, the final chord. It did not crash, it dissolved, gently, slowly, like morning snow melting beneath the warmth of a sun that finally showed its face. And when the last vibration left the strings, Clara let her hands fall into her lap. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full. And then, it came. Applause that shook the chandeliers, gasps, shouts, standing ovation. But Clara barely heard any of it. She looked at Miles, he looked at her. And for a moment, neither of them smiled. They simply saw one another. Truly. As if the music had lifted the masks off their faces and left only truth behind. He leaned close, his voice trembling. "We did it." She nodded. "No, we remembered it." They stood, bowed together, and let the world rise around them. The rest of the night blurred. Photographs, interviews, invitations to tour, critics declaring the piece the most soul-shaking performance in a generation. But later, much later, when the lights had dimmed and the guests had gone, Clara returned alone to the stage. The piano still sat in the quiet, waiting like a friend who never asks more than you're willing to give. She sat again, no audience this time, no Miles, just her. And she played, not the requiem, not the anthem. She played the first piece she ever learned, the one her mother taught her when her fingers were too small to reach an octave, a child's melody, pure, uneven, honest. And when she finished, she rested her hands on the wood, closed her eyes, and whispered the words she never got to say. "I made it, Mama. I made it." The lights above flickered, the opera house sighed, and somewhere in the rafters, if you listened closely, you could almost hear a woman's voice, humming along in the shadows. "Why haven't you answered him?" Alfred's voice floated gently across the crackling line. His English accent, usually precise as a clock's tick, carried a rare hint of warmth tonight, as if even he, the butler of secrets and polished manners, had begun to care too deeply. Clara stared out the window of her flat in London, watching the rain drizzle along the glass like the pages of a worn score slipping from her hands. The world outside was muted and gray, a distant hum beneath the quiet ache of her silence. She held the phone closer. "Because I don't know what to say." "You do," Alfred replied softly. "You're just afraid to hear it out loud." She didn't answer. Not at first. A week had passed since the Palais Garnier performance. A week of letters and offers, of articles and strangers quoting lines from the Requiem as if it had rewritten their own memories. People approached her on the street with tears in their eyes. Journalists called her the echo of a forgotten age. Critics argued over who deserved more credit, Clara or Miles. But to her, none of it mattered. Only the silence from him did. He had written just once, no theatrics, no pleading, just a note delivered by hand. "I've composed the bridge, but I can't finish it without you." He left it unsigned, but she didn't need his name. She hadn't replied, because answering would mean stepping into something more vulnerable than even music had ever asked of her. It would mean telling the truth. Alfred, ever the perceptive soul, sighed through the line. "He's leaving for Vienna on Friday. The Conservatoire invited him to teach. It's a rare honor, one he nearly turned down." Clara felt her stomach tighten. Nearly? "He told me he'd go only if he had no reason to stay." Her breath caught. Alfred continued gently. "Forgive me, Miss Hayes, but I've seen many performances, many pianists, many composers, but I have never seen two people play like one the way you and Mr. Kingsley did." Clara closed her eyes. Rain tapped against the pane like distant applause. "Then why?" She whispered. "Is it so hard to walk toward something when you finally hear it calling your name?" There was no answer. Just the soft, knowing quiet of an old man who had heard that same question echo through lifetimes. That night, Clara didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at her piano, her mother's piano, and stared at the blank page before her. The Requiem was complete. The world had heard it. The world had loved it. But there was still one melody lingering inside her. Not as grand, not as tragic, but intimate, personal. It was the bridge Miles had spoken of. And she finally knew what it needed. At dawn, she gathered her things, a scarf, her scorebook, and the Duchess's pin. She tucked it into the lining of her coat, over her heart, like armor. She arrived at the train station just as the sky turned from ash to gold. The platform was nearly empty, save for a few commuters and an elderly woman feeding pigeons breadcrumbs from a lace pouch. Clara scanned the crowd, heart thudding. Then she saw him. Miles stood near the edge, a weathered suitcase at his feet, sheet music tucked under his arm. He looked older in the morning light, more man than boy, more composer than Critic's grandson. But his eyes were the same. They found her instantly. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Clara stepped forward. "I wrote something," she said, voice barely above the wind. He didn't blink. "Did you finish it?" "No," she said. "We did." She reached into her coat, pulled out the folded pages, and handed them to him. He read them silently. His lips parted slightly as his eyes traced the notes, the chords, the crescendo she had left just for him. When he looked up, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "Clara? This is us," she said. "All the pauses, all the mistakes, all the spaces where you didn't know what came next." His hands shook as he held the pages. "I thought you wouldn't come," he admitted. "I thought maybe I was the only one who felt it." She smiled, eyes misting. "I didn't know I needed to feel anything until I heard you in the silence after our last note." A pause. Then she asked, "Are you still going?" He looked down at the train schedule, back at her. "I think I was, unless there's another stage calling." "There is," she said, "but it's not in Vienna, and it's not in Paris." He tilted his head. "Where then?" She reached out, placed her hand gently over his chest, felt the beat beneath her fingers. "Right there," she whispered. "That's the only place our music belongs." The station bell rang, a final call. But neither of them moved. Miles stepped closer. "Then let's go write it," Clara nodded, and together they turned from the platform, not toward a train, not toward a crowd, but toward a city waking to the sound of possibility. They walked side by side, the score between them. A duet still unfinished, but no longer alone. The old church stood on the outskirts of London, wrapped in ivy and memory. Its bell tower no longer rang for Sunday service, and the pews hadn't been filled in years. But the acoustics, ancient, sacred, pure, remained untouched. It was the place Clara chose for their first private rehearsal since the station. She arrived before Miles. The keys to the church had been loaned to her by a former music teacher, a woman who once told Clara, "Play like someone's always listening, even if no one's in the room." Now the wooden doors creaked open to let her in, as if the space had been waiting, as if it too remembered. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows in fractured beams of crimson and sapphire. Dust floated in the air like music unplayed. Clara walked down the center aisle, her fingertips brushing the edge of each pew, and slowly approached the baby grand she had helped restore years ago as a student volunteer. It sat covered, its polished surface quiet and expectant. She pulled the cloth back with reverence, as one might unveil an heirloom passed from hand to trembling hand. And then, for a while, she simply stood, alone with the silence, the kind that didn't feel empty, but full of all the things that hadn't yet been said. Her fingers found the keys again. She didn't warm up, didn't test scales. She just began. The bridge they had written together, hers and Miles', tumbled from her hands like water breaking over smooth stones. The notes weren't perfect. Her left hand slipped. Her wrist was too tight, but the emotion was there, and for the first time she let it come without restraint. Footsteps echoed softly behind her. She didn't stop playing. Miles entered quietly, standing just inside the doorway. He didn't speak, didn't call her name. He simply stood and listened, his head bowed like someone at prayer. When she finished, she didn't look at him. She stayed facing forward, her hands resting on the last chord. "I didn't want to play it alone," she said. "You weren't," he replied, walking forward. He took the seat beside her. Close, but not touching. The bench creaked gently beneath the weight of what neither of them had dared say yet. He opened the folder he had brought, laying out the full score. Their score, the requiem, the bridge, the new piece they hadn't named yet. It sprawled across the music stand like a tapestry of ink and vulnerability. "I have something," he said, voice low. "A final movement." Her breath caught. "You finished it?" "No," he said. "I dreamed it." He placed a page in front of her. The notation was fluid, the melody quiet but persistent. She sight-read it silently with her eyes, and as the shape of it settled in her mind, her lips parted in awe. "You wrote this after the station?" "I wrote it after I watched you walk toward me," he said. "After I realized the silence between us had more harmony than anything I'd ever composed." They played it together. The notes moved through the old church like candlelight, wrapping around the stone walls, filling the air with something too tender to name. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't complex, it was honest. And sometimes that was the bravest thing of all. When they reached the final line, the music faded into the smallest of silences. Neither moved. Then Clara said, "I don't want this to be just one piece or one performance. I want us to build something, together, for real." Miles turned toward her, his eyes clouded, but soft. "Then let's do it." "A conservatory," she whispered, eyes wide now. "Not for the rich, not for the famous, for the forgotten, for the ones no one sees until it's too late." He blinked. "A school?" "A home," she said, "a place where the girl who showed up in borrowed shoes still gets a seat at the piano." The idea came not like lightning, but like sunrise, slow, inevitable, full of light. Miles nodded. "We could call it Eloise," Clara smiled. "We'll call it Harmony." They didn't need to write it down. It had already been written in them. The next weeks moved like music, chords building, crescendos rising, words spread quickly. The Palais Garnier released an official partnership statement. Lady Charlotte pledged seed funding. Lord Kingsley, stoic and unbending, donated the Duchess's entire music library to the cause. "It's time her voice teaches again," he'd said, surprising even himself. Applications flooded in from every corner of the country. Letters from children who had been laughed at, from janitors who played after hours, from street performers who knew more about storytelling than technique. All of them hoping to be heard. Clara read each one. She answered every single letter by hand, and in the quiet hours of each evening she returned to that church alone and played. Because the music wasn't about fame. It never had been. It was about giving sound to those who had been silenced, and now they were building a place where that sound could grow. Together. The opening night of Harmony was unlike anything Clara had ever imagined. Not grand, not gilded, but raw and impossibly beautiful. No red carpets, no paparazzi, no whispered commentary from socialites in tailored gowns. Instead, the courtyard of the old converted theater pulsed with laughter, mismatched folding chairs, fairy lights strung by volunteers, and the sound of piano keys echoing from rooms once forgotten by time. There were children with borrowed instruments tucked beneath their arms, teens with wrinkled button-downs, eyes wide with fear and wonder, older musicians who hadn't touched a stage in 20 years, but stood beneath the archways as if their shadows had never truly left. And in the middle of it all stood Clara. She wore a simple black dress, no diamonds, no perfume. Just the Duchess's pin over her heart and a thin silver bracelet that had once belonged to her mother, tarnished in places but warm with memory. A girl named Sonia, a 12-year-old prodigy who once played in train stations for coins, clung to Clara's side. "Is it true?" she asked, eyes shining. "You used to play in your kitchen?" Clara smiled. "I still do." Sonia's brows furrowed. "But now you have concert halls." Clara knelt so they were eye to eye. "Halls are built from money," she said gently. "But music is made in kitchens, in basements, in bus stops and church pews. Don't ever forget where your music was born." Sonia nodded solemnly, and Clara pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. The lights dimmed across the courtyard. One by one, candles were lit along the aisle leading to the outdoor stage, a simple wooden platform backed by a piano that had been rescued from a flooded school. Clara stood at the edge of it now, her fingers brushing the wood grain. Miles approached, a soft smile playing at the corners of his lips. He looked at her the way someone might look at the horizon, like it carried both peace and something unnamed just beyond reach. "You ready?" he asked. "No," she said. "But I'm not scared anymore." He held out his hand. She took it. The two walked onto the stage together, hand in hand, not as stars, not as performers, but as founders of a promise. The applause that greeted them wasn't thunderous. It was warm, human, like rain on a tin roof. It filled the air with something quiet and certain. "You belong here. We all do." Miles stepped to the microphone first. "Tonight isn't about us," he said. "It's about all of you." He gestured to the students, the dreamers, the forgotten. This school was built on a single note, a girl sitting at a piano with nothing but her memory and a melody that didn't ask permission to be heard. He looked at Clara, and she changed everything. Clara stepped forward. The crowd stilled. "When I was a little girl," she said, her voice low but sure, "I thought music was something you had to earn, that you had to be rich or chosen or perfect." She looked out at them, at every face, every story waiting to be written. "But music doesn't wait for permission. It's already inside you. You don't need to be invited. You are the invitation." She turned to the piano. "Tonight, I play not as a performer, not even as a teacher, but as someone who still believes music is where we find ourselves when the world forgets us." She sat and began. She didn't play the Requiem or the Anthem. She played something new, a composition no one had heard yet, one she and Miles had written in the quiet days between paperwork and paintbrushes, in the dust of unfinished classrooms and the hope of dreams they hadn't dared speak aloud yet. It was called Welcome. It began with a single note, held long, let linger, then another and another. The melody built slowly, rising not in glory but in grace. It danced like candlelight across the keys, uncertain at first, then growing bolder. There were pauses, measured, breathing, full of silence that didn't feel empty but alive. The audience didn't move. They barely breathed. It was a song that didn't ask for attention. It asked to be remembered. As Clara played, she thought of her mother, of the attic where it all began. She thought of Lord Kingsley's scowl and how it melted into stillness. She thought of Miles, who now turned every measure into a letter she hadn't known how to write. And she thought of the girl she used to be, the one standing at the edge of the gala stage, heart racing, knees shaking, ready to be erased. That girl was still inside her. But now she had a home. The final chord drifted into the night like smoke, and as silence settled once more, the candles flickered. Some wept, some smiled, some simply stared, as if they'd just met themselves for the first time in years. And then the applause came, not as a wave, but as a ripple. A standing ovation, not for fame, but for belonging. Clara rose, bowed deeply, and when she stood straight again, Miles was beside her. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His hand found hers, and in front of the world, he pulled her gently into his arms and kissed her, not with fanfare, not with fireworks, but with the quiet certainty of someone who finally found home. The crowd cheered, laughed, wept, and somewhere in the farthest row, Alfred stood with his gloves tucked neatly into his coat, eyes misted, lips pressed together in something like a prayer. Harmony had begun, and it was everything music was meant to be. A year later, the building was alive with sound. Not perfect sound, no. It was full of wrong notes and missed cues, laughter mid-phrases, violins tuning too loud in the next room. But there was joy in the mess, and something sacred in its lack of polish. Harmony wasn't just a school anymore. It was a living thing. Its walls were covered in mismatched artwork from the students, pages of music pinned between portraits of composers who had never graced a conservatory brochure. The practice rooms were always full. The library smelled of old scores and newer dreams. And every Thursday evening, after classes ended and the sun bled gold into the windows, Clara would unlock the main recital hall and sit quietly at the grand piano, waiting. Sometimes she played alone, sometimes students joined her. Sometimes Miles would arrive late, trailing ink-stained fingers and new chord ideas scribbled on napkins. This Thursday, the final one before the holiday break, Clara sat before the piano with a letter in her lap. The envelope was ivory, the seal royal. Inside, an invitation. Royal Jubilee Celebration, a performance requested by Lady Charlotte, featuring Clara Hayes and the students of Harmony, a return, a recognition. But this time, no curtain would rise on a girl who needed to prove herself. This time, they knew who she was before she ever touched the keys. Clara folded the letter slowly, her fingertips lingering on the edges. She placed it beside her and began to play. Not something grand, but something familiar. A lullaby. Soft. Measured. Full of space. One by one, students wandered in, drawn by the melody. Some brought instruments, others brought only silence. But they all gathered around her, listening as if each note held a secret. Miles stepped in last. He leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes soft. "She's still with you," he said. Clara didn't look up. She never left. He walked over, took the bench beside her. The room quieted. Even the restless ones stilled. And together they began to play. Not for applause, not for recognition, but for the memory of where it started. For the girl with shaking hands on a borrowed stage. For the boy afraid of not being enough. For the people who had been told no too many times. And for the mothers, those who had taught them in whispers and lullabies, in quiet courage and sacrifice. The music rose slowly, then bloomed. The room filled with something larger than harmony. It filled with home. And as the final chord echoed through the rafters, every soul in the room felt it. They had built something eternal. Not a legacy, not a brand, but a place where no one had to ask for permission to be heard. Where silence had a melody, where forgotten voices had finally found their song. To anyone listening, this story was never just about music. It was about silence. The kind that comes after rejection. The kind that follows humiliation. And how one young girl dared to fill it. Not with bitterness, but with beauty. Clara Hayes stood before the world with nothing but her memory, her mother's melody, and hands that had been doubted too many times. But instead of folding, she played. And in doing so, she reminded us all that talent isn't defined by where you come from. It's shaped by where you choose to go, even when the door is slammed in your face. Miles Kingsley, once buried under legacy and fear, learned that the most meaningful compositions are born not in perfection, but in vulnerability. Together, they built harmony. Not just a conservatory, but a sanctuary for every forgotten dream. So if you've ever been silenced, overlooked, or told you weren't enough, remember this. The world needs your music. Your story isn't small. It's waiting to be heard. Not in the spotlight, but in the quiet spaces where truth lives, and where your courage to speak, to play, to rise, becomes a symphony no one can ignore. You are the key. Now play.